The blood dripped from Daniel Everett's raw, blistered hands onto the dry earth of eastern Colorado territory, each crimson drop a testament to his stubborn determination. It was the summer of 1871, and the blazing sun over Trinidad showed no mercy to a man with 20 fence posts still to set before nightfall. He'd been working since dawn, driving posts into the unyielding ground, his leather gloves long since worn through at the palms, but stopping wasn't an option, not when winter pasture meant survival. Daniel wiped sweat from his brow with his forearm, leaving a streak of dirt and blood across his sun-weathered face. At 32, he was no stranger to hard work, but today the labor seemed particularly punishing. The new plot of land he'd purchased on the outskirts of Trinidad was proving to be more challenge than bargain, with its rocky soil and the constant threat of cattle rustlers from the south requiring secure fencing. He squinted into the distance, where heat waves danced above the prairie grass, making the horizon shimmer like a mirage. That's when he first saw her, a lone figure on horseback approaching his property line. Daniel tensed, his right hand instinctively moving to the revolver at his hip. Out here, strangers rarely meant good news. As the rider drew closer, he could make out a woman with auburn hair catching the sunlight beneath a wide-brimmed hat. She rode astride rather than side saddle, her posture suggesting comfort and experience in the saddle. When she was within earshot, she raised a hand in greeting. "Afternoon," she called, her voice carrying across the open land. "Looks like you've got yourself a project there." Daniel nodded curtly, not in the mood for pleasantries. His hands throbbed and the fence wouldn't build itself. "Just doing what needs doing, madam." She dismounted with easy grace, leading her chestnut mare closer. That's when Daniel noticed the saddlebags laden with tools. She was dressed practically in a split riding skirt and a cotton blouse, both showing signs of honest work. "I'm Lydia Turner," she said, extending her hand. "I own the neighboring property to the east." Daniel hesitated before accepting her handshake, conscious of his bloody palms. "Daniel Everett bought this place from old man Jenkins last month." Lydia's eyes widened at the sight of his hands. "Good Lord, Mr. Everett, you're bleeding something awful." "It'll heal," he replied gruffly, turning back to the fence post he'd been setting. He lifted the heavy mallet again, wincing as his torn skin stretched with the movement. "At this rate, you'll be crippled before you finish," Lydia observed, crossing her arms over her chest. She sized up the remaining work with a critical eye. "Why don't you have help?" "Can't afford to hire anyone yet," Daniel admitted reluctantly. "Got everything I had tied up in this land." Lydia nodded thoughtfully, then began rolling up her sleeves. "Rest a while," she said, not as a suggestion but a command. "I'll finish the fence." Daniel laughed, a short, disbelieving sound. "No offense, madam, but this isn't ladies' work. And bleeding until you can't hold a coffee cup isn't particularly smart work," she countered, already moving toward her horse to retrieve what he now saw was a set of work gloves from her saddlebag. "I've been building fences since I was tall enough to hold a hammer. My father didn't have sons." Before Daniel could protest further, she'd taken the mallet from his hands and positioned herself by the post he'd been struggling with. With surprising strength, she drove it deeper into the ground with 3 precise strikes. "You should wash those hands and wrap them properly," she said without looking at him, already moving to the next post. "Infection out here can kill a man faster than any gunslinger." Daniel stood frozen, torn between pride and practicality. The woman clearly knew what she was doing, handling the tools with practiced ease. Finally, practical sense won out. He walked to the water barrel near his half-built cabin, dunked his hands in the cool water, and watched as clouds of red dispersed through the liquid. "Why are you helping me?" He called to her as he dried his hands on a relatively clean portion of his shirt. Lydia paused, resting on the mallet handle. "Out here, neighbors look after neighbors, Mr. Everett. That's how we all survive." She resumed her work, adding, "Besides, my cattle will be using the northern pasture come winter. I have a vested interest in a solid fence line." As Daniel reluctantly sat on the stump he used as a workbench and began wrapping strips of cloth around his hands, he studied his unexpected helper. Lydia Turner moved with purpose and efficiency, her movements economical yet powerful. She wasn't what anyone would call delicate. Her skin was tanned from outdoor work, her hands calloused, but there was an undeniable grace in how she handled herself. "How long have you been in Trinidad?" he asked, curiosity finally overcoming his pride. "5 years," she replied between hammer strikes. "Came out with my father in '66. He passed last winter, pneumonia took him, left me the ranch and everything that comes with it." "You run it alone?" Daniel couldn't keep the surprise from his voice. "Got 3 good hands who stayed on after Pa died. They're loyal men who don't mind taking orders from a woman, long as the orders make sense." She finished setting a post and moved to the next. "What brings you to these parts, Mr. Everett?" Daniel sighed, flexing his bandaged hands. "War left me restless. Tried settling back east after Appomattox, but city life didn't suit me anymore. Figured I'd try my hand at ranching. Always loved horses." "You fought for the Union?" she asked, pausing in her work to study him. "Yes, madam." "8th Illinois Cavalry," he replied, wondering if that would be a problem. Colorado had seen its share of Confederate sympathizers during the war. To his relief, she nodded approvingly. "My father was with the 2nd Colorado. He'd have appreciated a Union man for a neighbor." They fell into a comfortable silence, broken only by the steady rhythm of Lydia's work. Daniel found himself relaxing on the stump, the tension of the day easing from his shoulders as he watched her methodically completing the task he'd been killing himself over. By the time the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Lydia had set the remaining fence posts. She stood back, wiping sweat from her brow, and surveyed her work. "We can string the wire tomorrow," she said matter-of-factly. "It'll go faster with 2, even with your hands the way they are." Daniel questioned, rising from his seat. "You've already done more than enough, Miss Turner," Mrs., she corrected him. "And I told you I have a vested interest in this fence. Besides, what else would I do tomorrow? Church isn't until Sunday." Daniel felt a twinge of disappointment at the misses, but quickly dismissed it. Of course a capable woman like Lydia wouldn't be unmarried out here. "Your husband doesn't mind you helping strange men with their fencing?" he asked, trying to keep his tone light. A shadow crossed Lydia's face. "My husband was killed 3 years ago. Cattle thieves caught him checking the herd after dark." Her voice was steady, but Daniel recognized the controlled pain in it. He'd heard it in his own voice enough times when speaking of the war. "I'm sorry," he said simply. Lydia nodded once, acknowledging his sympathy without dwelling on it. "Life goes on, Mr. Everett. We adapt or we perish." She gathered her tools and returned them to her saddlebags. "I should head back before it gets too dark. I'll return tomorrow around 9 if that suits." "I'll have coffee ready," Daniel offered. "And please call me Daniel." A small smile touched her lips, the first he'd seen. "Lydia, then." She mounted her horse with practiced ease. "And Daniel, soak those hands in warm, salt water tonight. It'll help with the healing." Before he could thank her properly, she'd turned her mare and was riding eastward toward her own property. Daniel watched until she disappeared into the gathering dusk, feeling something he hadn't experienced in a long time, a sense of not being entirely alone against the world. That night, as he soaked his hands in salt water by lantern light in his sparse cabin, Daniel replayed the afternoon in his mind. Trinidad had seemed like a place to start over, to build something that was his alone. He hadn't expected to find himself indebted to a neighbor on his very first month, much less a woman who could drive fence posts with more skill than most men he'd known. As he lay on his simple cot, listening to the night sounds of the Colorado prairie, Daniel realized he was looking forward to morning in a way he hadn't since before the war. The thought troubled him almost as much as it pleased him. Getting attached to anyone or anything had proven dangerous in his experience. Still, as sleep finally claimed him, his last conscious thought was of auburn hair gleaming in the afternoon sun. True to her word, Lydia arrived at 9 the next morning, her horse pulling a small cart loaded with wire, additional tools, and what appeared to be a basket covered with a checkered cloth. Daniel had been up since dawn, his bandaged hands still painful but less raw thanks to her advice about the salt water. He'd managed to brew coffee and was waiting with 2 tin cups when she rode up. "Morning," he called, walking out to meet her. Coffee's hot if you're interested. Never been known to refuse a cup, she replied, dismounting and accepting the offered drink. She nodded toward his hands. How are they today? Better, thanks to your remedy, Daniel admitted. I can hold things without wanting to curse, which is improvement enough. Lydia's lips quirked in a half smile. Good, you'll be needing both hands for wire work. She took a sip of coffee and raised her eyebrows, strong enough to stand a spoon in. You learned to make coffee in the army, is it that obvious? Daniel chuckled. Never quite broke the habit of army strength brew. It'll put hair on your chest, that's for certain. Her eyes crinkled at the corners when she smiled, he noticed. I brought some biscuits and preserves, thought we might need sustenance if we're to finish this fence today. They worked well together, falling into an easy rhythm. Daniel held the wire taut while Lydia secured it to the posts, their conversation flowing naturally as they moved down the line. By midday, they'd completed half the fence, and Lydia suggested they break for lunch. Under the shade of the lone cottonwood tree near Daniel's cabin, they shared the biscuits she'd brought, along with some dried venison he contributed. The simple meal tasted better than anything Daniel could remember eating in recent memory, though whether that was due to honest hunger or the company, he couldn't say. How'd you learn ranching? He asked as they ate. Most women I've known preferred more domestic pursuits. Lydia brushed crumbs from her lap, considering his question. Necessity, mostly. My mother died when I was young, childbirth. The baby, too. After that, it was just Pa and me. She gazed out across the rolling landscape. He needed help, and there wasn't money for hired hands back then. So I learned to ride, rope, and build alongside him. By the time I was 16, I could do most everything a ranch hand could. Didn't that make things difficult when it came to? Daniel hesitated, not wanting to pry. Finding a husband, Lydia finished for him, amusement in her voice. You can say it, Daniel. I'm not some delicate flower who wilts at plain speaking, he nodded, feeling his face warm slightly. Yes, that. I suppose some men were put off by a woman who could outride and outshoot them, she acknowledged. But Robert, my husband, he admired it. Said he wanted a partner, not a porcelain doll. A genuine smile touched her lips at the memory. We had 2 good years before the thieves took him. No children? Daniel asked softly. Lydia shook her head. Not for lack of hoping, just wasn't in God's plan for us, I suppose. She dusted off her hands and stood, clearly ready to change the subject. And you, the war's been over 6 years. No wife waiting somewhere while you build this place. Daniel rose as well, gathering the remnants of their meal. No, there was someone before the war. Elizabeth was her name. We had plans, but she found someone else while you were away, Lydia guessed. She died, Daniel said simply. Typhoid fever swept through her town in '63. By the time her letter reached me, she'd been buried a month. Lydia's expression softened. I'm sorry, Daniel. Seems we've both had our share of loss. It was a long time ago, he replied, though they both knew such losses were never truly relegated to the past. Shall we finish this fence? They returned to work, but something had shifted between them. The sharing of their respective griefs had created a tentative bond, a recognition of kindred spirits. As the afternoon wore on, their conversation turned to lighter topics: the best methods for breaking horses, the merits of different cattle breeds for the harsh Colorado winters, local gossip about Trinidad's colorful inhabitants. By the time the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, they had completed the fence line. They stood side by side, surveying their handiwork with satisfaction. It's a good fence, Lydia declared. Should keep your stock in and trouble out, at least from this direction. Couldn't have done it without you, Daniel admitted freely, his earlier pride forgotten. I'm in your debt, Lydia, she waved away his thanks. Consider it an investment in good neighborly relations. Besides, she added with a mischievous glint in her eye, now I know who to call when my roof needs patching. Daniel laughed, surprising himself with how natural it felt. Fair enough. Anytime you need an extra pair of hands once these have healed up properly, you just send word. As Lydia prepared to leave, loading her tools back into the cart, Daniel found himself reluctant to see her go. You should stay for supper, he blurted out. It's the least I can do, though I warn you, my cooking skills are limited to what can be done over an open fire. Lydia hesitated, seeming to weigh the propriety of the invitation against her own inclinations. "I should get back," she finally said. "My foreman, Jim, will be wondering where I've disappeared to these past 2 days." Daniel nodded, hiding his disappointment. "Of course, another time, perhaps." "Perhaps," she agreed, her expression unreadable. Then, making a sudden decision, she added, "Why don't you come to supper at my place tomorrow, 6 o'clock? My cook, Maria, makes the best chili Colorado you've ever tasted." Daniel blinked, surprised by the counter-invitation. "I wouldn't want to impose. It's not an imposition if you're invited," she pointed out logically. "Besides, neighbors should know one another properly. My ranch is 3 miles east. Just follow the creek until you see the big red barn. You can't miss it." Before he could formulate a response, she mounted her horse, nodded once in farewell, and set off toward home, the small cart rattling behind her. Daniel stood watching until she disappeared over the rise, a strange mixture of anticipation and trepidation settling in his chest. The next day passed with agonizing slowness as Daniel attempted to make himself and his humble cabin more presentable. He shaved carefully, cursing as his still tender hands made the task more difficult than usual. He found his least worn shirt, a blue cotton one that Elizabeth had once said matched his eyes, and did his best to press out the worst of the wrinkles. At 5:30, he saddled his gelding, Atlas, and set out eastward following the creek as Lydia had instructed. True to her word, the Turner ranch was impossible to miss. Unlike his modest beginnings, Lydia's spread was a well-established operation with a large 2-story farmhouse, a prominent red barn, several outbuildings, and extensive corrals containing quality horses. He could see cattle grazing on the hillsides beyond, their numbers suggesting prosperity. Daniel felt a momentary pang of inadequacy. His own plans suddenly seemed childishly ambitious in comparison. While he'd saved a decent sum from his army pay and subsequent work, it would take years of hard labor to build anything approaching what stood before him. As he approached the main house, a man emerged from the barn, tall, weathered, with steel-gray hair and the bow-legged stance of a lifelong horseman. He watched Daniel's approach with the wary assessment common to those who'd survived frontier life. "Evening," Daniel called as he reined Atlas to a stop. "I'm Daniel Everett. Mrs. Turner invited me for supper." The man's expression remained neutral. "Jim Holloway, ranch foreman," he replied, stepping forward to hold Atlas's bridle. "Mrs. Turner mentioned you'd be coming. You can stable your horse in the second stall on the left. There's fresh hay and water." Daniel thanked him and dismounted, leading Atlas into the spacious barn. As he saw to his horse's comfort, Jim lingered nearby, clearly taking his measure. "So you're the neighbor, Mrs. Turner's been helping," the foreman observed. "She says you're planning to raise horses." "That's the plan," Daniel confirmed. "Thoroughbreds eventually, once I've established the place." Jim nodded slowly. "Ambitious. This land's better for cattle than horses, generally speaking." "I've some experience with breeding stock," Daniel explained, not mentioning that said experience came from working at his uncle's stables back in Illinois, not from running his own operation. "The market for quality mounts is growing with the railroad expansion." "True enough," Jim conceded. He seemed about to say more when the back door of the house opened, and Lydia emerged onto the porch. "Are you planning to keep our guest in the barn all evening, Jim?" she called, her tone gently admonishing but affectionate. "Just getting acquainted, Mrs. Turner," Jim replied, a slight smile softening his weathered features. He turned to Daniel. "Best not keep the lady waiting. She runs a tight ship around here." Daniel followed Jim across the yard to the house, where Lydia awaited them. She was dressed differently than he'd seen her before, wearing a simple blue dress that complemented her auburn hair, which was pinned up more formally than during their fence building. She looked every inch the respectable rancher's widow, though there was no disguising the capable strength in her bearing. "Welcome to Willow Creek Ranch," she greeted him, using the name for the first time. "I'm glad you could come." "Thank you for the invitation," Daniel replied, suddenly acutely aware of his plain clothes and rough appearance despite his efforts. The house behind her looked well-appointed, with proper glass windows and painted trim a far cry from his rudimentary cabin. "Jim, would you tell Maria we'll be ready to eat shortly?" Lydia asked her foreman, who nodded and disappeared around the side of the house. Once he'd gone, she turned back to Daniel. Don't mind him, he's protective, been with my father since before I was born. Seems like a good man to have on your side, Daniel observed, following her into the house. The interior was comfortable without being ostentatious solid furniture, some good rugs covering the wooden floors, oil lamps casting a warm glow as the evening approached. Family photographs and a few modest paintings adorned the walls. It was a home, not just a house, speaking of years of careful building and attention. This is a fine place, Daniel said honestly. Your father must have worked hard to establish it. He did, Lydia agreed, leading him into a parlor. Started with nothing but a tent and 50 head of longhorns in '66. By the time he died, we had over 500 cattle and nearly 1,000 acres. There was no boasting in her tone, just straightforward acknowledgement of facts. And you've kept it going, Daniel noted with admiration. Had to, she replied simply. It was his dream, and then it became mine and Robert's. Now it's just mine. She gestured for him to take a seat. Would you like a drink before supper? I have some decent whiskey. The evening progressed pleasantly from there. Supper was indeed excellent, the promised chili Colorado served with fresh tortillas made by Maria, a stout Mexican woman who clearly ruled the kitchen with an iron hand. Jim joined them at the table, along with two other ranch hands brothers named Thomas and Samuel Watson, who addressed Lydia with respect but spoke to her with the easy familiarity of men who'd worked alongside her for years. The conversation flowed naturally, focusing mainly on ranch business, local affairs, and the eternal subjects of weather and cattle prices. Daniel found himself relaxing, contributing where he could and listening attentively where he couldn't. These people operated as a well-oiled unit, each knowing their role and respecting the others. It was, he realized with a pang, something like a family. After the meal, the ranch hands excused themselves for evening chores, and Maria retired to her quarters off the kitchen, leaving Daniel and Lydia alone in the parlor with coffee. You have good people around you, Daniel observed, settling into an armchair near the small fire Jim had built to ward off the evening chill. They respect you. They respected my father first, Lydia acknowledged, sitting across from him, but yes, they're loyal. I couldn't run this place without them. She studied him over the rim of her coffee cup. And you, will you try to do everything alone on your place? Daniel sighed, considering the question, not by choice. But hired help costs money, and I've sunk most of what I had into the land and initial stock. I'll need to make it through the first year or two before I can think about bringing on regular hands. A sensible approach, she agreed, though there are ways to reduce costs. Many ranchers take on hands who work for room, board, and a small wage with the promise of a larger share when the profits come in, especially younger men looking to learn the business. I've considered it, Daniel admitted, but first I need to prove I know what I'm doing myself. He smiled ruefully. Hard to inspire confidence when I'm still building my own cabin. Everyone starts somewhere, Lydia reminded him. My father's first cattle drive ended with him losing 1/3 of his herd at a river crossing. The next year, he built a proper bridge and never lost another cow to that river. They talked for another hour, the conversation gradually shifting from practical ranch matters to more personal topics. Daniel found himself sharing stories from his childhood in Illinois, his time at university before the war interrupted his studies, and even some of the more bearable memories from his military service. In turn, Lydia told him about growing up as the only child of a determined widower, learning to read by lamplight from her father's few books, and the challenges of being taken seriously as a female rancher after Robert's death. The bank tried to pressure me to sell after the funeral, she revealed, a hardness entering her voice. Suggested I couldn't possibly manage on my own, that I should take what I could get and move back east to live with proper society. What did you do? Daniel asked, though he could guess the answer. A slow smile spread across Lydia's face. I doubled the herd size that year and paid off the rest of my father's loan. The bank manager hasn't suggested I sell since. When Daniel finally rose to leave, the clock on the mantel showed it was past 10. I've imposed on your hospitality far too long, he said apologetically. Thank you for the meal and the company. Both were excellent. You're welcome anytime, Lydia replied, walking him to the door. Neighbors should look out for one another, as I said. At the threshold, Daniel paused, feeling there was more to say but uncertain how to say it. I'd like to return the favor, he finally managed. Though I can't offer nearly the comfort you have here, but perhaps when my hands are fully healed I could invite you for a meal. I make a passable stew, at least according to my army companions. I'd like that, Lydia said, her voice softening slightly. Just send word when you're ready for company. As Daniel rode home under a sky brilliant with stars, he found himself replaying the evening in his mind, analyzing each conversation, each glance. It had been a long time since he'd felt so at ease with anyone, much less a woman. There was something about Lydia Turner that both intrigued and comforted him, her straightforward manner, her quiet confidence, the way she'd carved out her place in a world that often had little respect for a woman alone. The next weeks established a pattern between them. Daniel continued work on his modest ranch, building corrals, expanding his cabin, and preparing for the arrival of the breeding stock he'd arranged to purchase from his uncle back east. Lydia would ride over every few days, sometimes bringing supplies she thought he might need, other times simply stopping to chat when she was checking her own fence lines. For his part, Daniel found excuses to visit Willow Creek Ranch as well, borrowing tools, seeking advice on local suppliers, occasionally helping with tasks that required an extra pair of hands. The ranch hands, initially wary, gradually accepted his presence, especially after he helped doctor a prized bull that had been gored in a fight, drawing on veterinary knowledge he'd gained working with horses. Jim Holloway remained somewhat reserved, though not unfriendly. One evening in early autumn, as Daniel was helping repair a damaged corral gate, the foreman finally spoke his mind. Mrs. Turner's been through a lot, Jim said without preamble, handing Daniel a hammer. She doesn't show it much, but losing Mr. Turner the way she did nearly broke her. Took her months before she'd even give orders again. Daniel paused in his work, meeting the older man's gaze directly. I understand you're looking out for her, that's as it should be. Jim nodded once. She seems to enjoy your company, just want to make sure your intentions are neighborly. My intentions are honest, Daniel replied carefully. I respect Mrs. Turner greatly. She's been kinder to me than anyone since I arrived in Trinidad. The foreman studied him for a long moment, then apparently reached some internal decision. She mentioned you're expecting some horses from back east. When are they due to arrive? Next month, if the rail shipment stays on schedule, Daniel said, relieved at the change in subject. 2 stallions and 4 mares to start with. That's a small herd to build from, Jim observed. Take years to establish a profitable breeding operation. It's what I can afford for now, Daniel acknowledged. I'm playing the long game, Jim nodded thoughtfully. Mrs. Turner might have some ideas about that. She's got a good head for business, better than her father ever did, truth be told. He returned to work, effectively ending the conversation, but Daniel sensed he'd passed some sort of test. The next day, Lydia appeared at his cabin just after noon, riding her chestnut mare and leading another horse, a magnificent bay gelding with the unmistakable lines of quarter-horse breeding. What do you think of him? She asked without preamble as Daniel walked out to greet her. He's 5 years old, well-trained for cattle work, and has a good temperament. Daniel approached the bay, running a practiced eye over the animal's conformation. He's a fine horse, he agreed, stroking the gelding's neck. Perfect for ranch work. Are you considering buying him? I already own him, Lydia replied. He's one of a pair I bought from a rancher moving to Oregon. I was thinking he might suit your operation better than mine. I have enough cattle horses, but you'll need reliable mounts if you're going to run a horse breeding business. Daniel frowned, confused. Are you offering to sell him to me? I appreciate the thought, but I don't have spare cash for another horse right now, not with the breeding stock arriving soon. Lydia dismounted, handing him the bay's reins. I'm not selling him. I'm proposing a partnership of sorts. You need working horses but are short on capital. I have extra horses but could use help with some aspects of my operation, specifically breaking and training new stock. Jim's getting too old for the rough work, and the Watson boys are better with cattle than horses. A partnership, Daniel repeated, still not fully understanding. You help train my young stock, you get the use of thunder here and potentially others as you need them, Lydia explained patiently. It benefits us both. Unless you're opposed to the idea of working together, the proposal made practical sense, but Daniel hesitated, his pride warring with pragmatism. It's a generous offer, but I don't want charity, Lydia, her expression hardened slightly. It's not charity, Daniel. It's business. I need someone with your skills, and you need resources I have. That's how things work out here. People find ways to help each other survive and thrive. She paused, then added more gently, think of it as an extension of neighbors helping neighbors. Put that way, Daniel found it difficult to refuse, and truthfully, the arrangement would solve several immediate problems for him. All right, he conceded, but we should formalize it somehow, write down the terms so there's no misunderstanding later. Lydia smiled, clearly pleased. Spoken like a cautious businessman, come to supper tomorrow and we'll draw up an agreement. Jim can witness it. That agreement marked the beginning of a closer relationship between the two ranches. Throughout the fall, Daniel spent several days each week at Willow Creek, working with Lydia's young horses and helping prepare the ranch for winter. In return, he gained not just the use of thunder but also access to equipment he couldn't yet afford, advice from Jim and the others about local conditions, and though it went unspoken, a sense of belonging he hadn't felt since before the war. His own property progressed as well. The breeding stock arrived from Illinois in late October, 2 fine thoroughbred stallions and 4 well-bred mares, all carefully selected by his uncle for their bloodlines and temperament. Lydia rode over the day they arrived by wagon from the railroad station, helping Daniel settle them into their new home. They are magnificent animals, she observed, watching as the horses explored their corral, getting accustomed to their new surroundings. Your uncle has a good eye. He's been breeding horses for 30 years, Daniel said with pride. Taught me everything I know about bloodlines and conformation. You'll need to protect that gray stallion especially, Lydia noted, nodding toward the lighter of the 2 male horses. Word will get around that you have quality stock here. Horse thieves are always a risk. Daniel nodded soberly, remembering how Lydia's husband had died. I've been thinking about that. Once the cabin addition is finished, I'll build a proper bunkhouse and hire at least 2 hands for security. A wise precaution, she agreed. In the meantime, perhaps you should consider moving the most valuable animals to Willow Creek for the winter. We have the space and more eyes keeping watch. The offer surprised him. That's going above and beyond our agreement, Lydia. She shrugged, her eyes still on the horses. It's practical. Losing any of these animals would set you back years. Besides, she added with a small smile, I admit I'd enjoy having such beautiful creatures around. It's been a while since I've worked with thoroughbreds. Daniel studied her profile, noting the way the autumn sunlight caught the auburn highlights in her hair. You keep surprising me, Lydia Turner. She turned to face him then, her expression open and direct. Is that a good thing or a bad thing, Daniel Everett? Good, he replied without hesitation. Definitely good. Winter came early that year with the first heavy snow falling in mid-November. Daniel had completed the essential structures on his property. The expanded cabin now boasted a proper bedroom separate from the main living area. The horse barn was snug and well provisioned with hay, and a small bunkhouse stood ready for future hands, though it remained empty for now. Following Lydia's advice, he'd moved his most valuable breeding stock to Willow Creek for the winter, keeping only Thunder and 2 of the mares at his own place. The arrangement meant regular trips between the properties, even as the weather turned harsh. Often, when snow made the return journey inadvisable, he would stay overnight at Willow Creek, sleeping in a spare room that had once belonged to Lydia's father. It was during one such winter evening, with snow falling heavily outside and the household gathered in the main room after supper, that Daniel first realized how deeply his feelings for Lydia had grown. Maria was teaching him to play a card game she'd learned in her youth, while Jim whittled by the fire and the Watson brothers argued good-naturedly about the merits of different cattle breeds. Lydia sat at her father's old desk in the corner, going over accounts by lamplight, occasionally joining in the conversation with a wry comment or gentle admonishment when the brothers' debate grew too heated. Daniel found his attention drawn repeatedly to her, noting the small furrow between her brows as she concentrated on her figures, the way she absently tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, the quiet authority she projected without effort. It struck him suddenly that this scene, this warm room filled with companionable activity, Lydia at its center, had become more like home to him than any place since his parents' house back in Illinois. The realization was both comforting and terrifying. He'd not allowed himself to become truly attached to anyone since Elizabeth's death, maintaining a careful emotional distance even in the closest of friendships. Yet somehow, over these past months, Lydia had bypassed those defenses without even trying. She must have felt his gaze, for she looked up then, meeting his eyes across the room. A question formed in her expression, and Daniel quickly returned his attention to the card game, his heart beating unexpectedly fast. Later that night, unable to sleep, he stood at the window of his borrowed room, watching the snow blanket the world in white silence. A soft knock at the door startled him. "Yes," he called, turning from the window. The door opened slightly and Lydia appeared, a woolen shawl wrapped around her shoulders over her nightgown and robe. "I saw the light under your door," she explained. "Is everything all right?" "Just restless," he replied, gesturing vaguely toward the window. "The storm shows no signs of letting up." Lydia stepped into the room, leaving the door ajar for propriety's sake. "We might be snowed in for a day or two," she agreed. "It happens every winter. The men know to prepare for it." An awkward silence fell between them, unusual in their typically easy companionship. Daniel found himself acutely aware of her presence, the faint scent of lavender that clung to her clothing, the way the lamplight cast soft shadows across her features. "Daniel," she said finally, her voice low. "May I ask you something directly?" He nodded, his throat suddenly dry. "Of course." Lydia met his gaze steadily. "These past months working together, I've come to value your company greatly, more than I expected to." She paused, seeming to choose her words carefully. "I need to know if I'm alone in feeling that our friendship has become something more." The directness of the question, so typical of Lydia, caught Daniel off guard, yet it also made a complicated situation simpler. There was no room for misunderstanding or equivocation in the face of such honesty. "You're not alone," he said quietly. "I've felt it too, but I've been hesitant to speak of it." "Why?" she asked, taking a step closer. Daniel sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Many reasons. You're established here, respected. I'm still proving myself. There's also the matter of your husband. I would never want to seem disrespectful to his memory." "Robert has been gone 3 years," Lydia said softly. "I mourned him deeply, and a part of me always will. But he wouldn't have wanted me to live the rest of my life alone." She reached out, touching Daniel's arm lightly. "As for the rest, since when has either of us cared much for what others think about propriety or position?" Despite the seriousness of the moment, Daniel found himself smiling. "A fair point. So," Lydia continued, her gaze unwavering, "where does that leave us?" Daniel took a deep breath. "I care for you, Lydia, more than I've cared for anyone in a very long time, but I don't want to rush into anything. We both know what it's like to lose someone suddenly. It makes a person cautious." Lydia nodded, understanding in her eyes. "I agree, we should take our time, be certain." A small smile touched her lips. "Though I must say, for two people who claim to want to proceed slowly, we've essentially been building a life together these past months." It was true, Daniel realized. Between their business arrangement, his regular presence at Willow Creek, and the way they'd naturally begun to consult one another on decisions both large and small, they had indeed been forming a partnership that went beyond mere friendship or neighborly assistance. "Perhaps," he suggested, "we should simply acknowledge what's already happening and see where it leads naturally." "A sensible approach," Lydia agreed, her smile widening slightly, "though I do think certain things should be made clear for propriety's sake if nothing else." "Such as?" Daniel asked. "Such as the fact that I would not be opposed if you wished to court me formally," she replied, a hint of mischief entering her expression. Jim has been giving you evaluating looks for weeks. I think the poor man would appreciate knowing your intentions are honorable." Daniel couldn't help but laugh. "Has he now? And here I thought I was being subtle." "About as subtle as a bull in a china shop," Lydia teased. "Though to be fair, I haven't been much better." The tension between them eased, replaced by a warm sense of possibility. Daniel reached out, taking Lydia's hand in his. "Lydia Turner, would you allow me to court you properly, with all the respect and consideration you deserve?" She squeezed his hand in return. "I would like that very much, Daniel Everett." It was a small moment, as moments go, two people acknowledging feelings that had been growing for months, standing in a borrowed room while a winter storm raged outside. Yet for Daniel, it felt monumental, a turning point as significant as any in his life. For the first time since the war, since Elizabeth, he was allowing himself to hope for a future that included more than just survival and solitary accomplishment. The blizzard kept them snowbound at Willow Creek for 3 days. During that time, Daniel and Lydia maintained proper decorum, making no overt displays of their changing relationship in front of the household. Nevertheless, Jim's knowing looks and Maria's suddenly more attentive service toward Daniel suggested that their understanding had not gone unnoticed. When the snow finally cleared enough for travel, Daniel prepared to return to his own property, concerned about the animals he'd left there. Lydia walked with him to the barn as he saddled Thunder, the two of them alone for the first time since their nighttime conversation. "Be careful riding back," she advised, handing him an extra pair of gloves she'd insisted he take. "The north slope might still have drifts." "I'll take the creek route," he assured her. "It's longer but safer." She nodded, watching as he finished securing his saddlebags. "Will you come to Sunday dinner?" Maria's been asking. Daniel smiled, recognizing the excuse for what it was. "I wouldn't miss it." Before mounting, he hesitated, then gently took Lydia's hand. "Thank you," he said softly, "for everything." Lydia looked up at him, her eyes reflecting the winter sunlight. "You don't need to thank me, Daniel." "Nevertheless," he insisted. Then, glancing once toward the barn door to ensure they were truly alone, he leaned down and placed a gentle, brief kiss on her cheek. "Until Sunday." The ride back to his property gave Daniel ample time to reflect on the developments of the past few days. Courting Lydia would not be like his youthful romance with Elizabeth, he knew. They were both older now, shaped by hardship and loss, with established lives and responsibilities. Yet perhaps that was for the better. They approached this new connection with clear eyes and honest hearts, knowing exactly what they were choosing and why. The remainder of that winter established a pattern for them. Daniel divided his time between his own ranch and Willow Creek, gradually taking on more responsibilities at the larger operation while continuing to develop his own property. He hired 2 hands of his own once the trails cleared enough for travel young men recommended by Jim, eager to learn the horse business and willing to work for modest wages. His courtship of Lydia progressed with the deliberate pace they'd agreed upon, respectful of her position in the community and mindful of the gossip that inevitably followed a widow's re-entry into romantic life. They attended church together in Trinidad on Sundays, took meals with friends and neighbors, and spent long evenings in conversation by the fire, getting to know each other more deeply. Daniel learned about Lydia's dreams for Willow Creek, her plans to expand into better breeding stock, her hope to one day establish a reputation that would draw buyers from as far as Denver and Santa Fe. In turn, he shared his vision for his own ranch, the specialized bloodlines he hoped to develop, his ideas for combining the hardiness of Western stock with the speed and elegance of Eastern thoroughbreds. Gradually, their separate visions began to merge into a shared future. They spoke hypothetically at first. If we combined our operations, we could. But with increasing concreteness as winter gave way to spring. It was during the first warm days of April, as they rode together checking fence lines along the boundary between their properties, that Daniel finally gave voice to what they'd been circling around for weeks. "Lydia," he said, bringing Thunder to a halt atop a small rise that overlooked both ranches. "I've been thinking about the future, our future specifically." She reined her mare in beside him, her expression curious but calm. I've been thinking about it too. Daniel took a deep breath. I love you. I think I have almost since that first day when you took over building my fence. You're the strongest, most capable, most remarkable woman I've ever known, and these past months have been the happiest of my life. A smile spread across Lydia's face. Are you practicing a speech, Daniel Everett? Maybe, he admitted with a sheepish grin. Is it working? Depends on what you're leading up to, she replied, though her eyes suggested she knew exactly where this was heading. Daniel dismounted and moved to help Lydia down from her horse, though she hardly needed the assistance. Once they were both standing on the grassy hilltop, he took her hands in his. I know we agreed to take things slowly, and by some standards we have. But I'm certain of what I want, Lydia, and I hope you feel the same. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small ring, a simple gold band with a modest diamond, purchased during his last trip into Denver. Will you marry me? Join our lives and our ranches together. Lydia looked at the ring, then back at Daniel's face. For a moment she was silent, and Daniel felt a flicker of uncertainty. Then she squeezed his hands tightly. Yes, she said simply. Yes to all of it. They were married in late May, when the prairie was alive with wildflowers and before the busiest season of ranch work began. The ceremony took place at the small church in Trinidad, with nearly the entire community in attendance. Jim Holloway stood as Daniel's best man, while Maria, radiant in a new dress sewn especially for the occasion, attended Lydia. The celebration afterward was held at Willow Creek Ranch, with tables set up under the cottonwood trees and food enough to feed half the county. As the afternoon wore into evening, with music playing and neighbors dancing, Daniel found a quiet moment with his new wife away from the festivities. Happy? He asked, his arm around her waist as they watched the sunset paint the distant mountains in shades of pink and gold. Very, Lydia replied, leaning into his embrace. Though I must say Mrs. Everett will take some getting used to after being Mrs. Turner for so long. You could have kept your name, Daniel pointed out. I wouldn't have minded. Lydia shook her head. No, I wanted the change. It feels right, a new name for a new chapter. She looked up at him, her eyes reflecting the fading sunlight. Besides, the ranch papers we signed yesterday list us as equal partners in all of it. Willow Creek, your place, everything we build together from here on. The name is just a formality. Daniel smiled, once again struck by her practical approach to even the most traditional of matters. Have I told you today how much I love you? Only about a dozen times, she replied with a laugh, but I don't tire of hearing it. They rejoined the celebration hand in hand, accepting congratulations and well wishes from neighbors and friends. As Daniel watched Lydia move through the crowd, gracious yet still unmistakably herself, the capable rancher who had first caught his attention by taking over his fence building, he felt a profound sense of gratitude. What had begun as a simple act of neighborly kindness had grown into something neither of them could have anticipated, but both now treasured beyond measure. In the years that followed, the combined Everett ranch prospered under their joint management. Daniel's thoroughbred breeding program gained recognition throughout the territory, while Lydia's cattle operation expanded and thrived. They built a new house halfway between the original homesteads, large enough for the family they hoped to have, but not ostentatious, a practical compromise typical of their approach to life together. Their first child, a son they named James Robert Everett in honor of both Jim Holloway and Lydia's first husband, arrived in the spring of 1873. A daughter, Mary Elizabeth, followed 2 years later, completing their family. Jim Holloway, now semi-retired but still very much part of the household, took particular delight in teaching young James to ride almost before the boy could walk properly. On the 5th anniversary of the day they'd first met, Daniel and Lydia rode out together to the fence line that had marked the beginning of their story. The original posts had been replaced over the years, but the boundary itself remained, no longer separating their properties, but now marking the southern edge of their combined land. It's hard to believe it's been 5 years, Lydia remarked as they dismounted near one of the newer posts. Sometimes it feels like yesterday that I rode up and found you bleeding all over your fence line. Daniel laughed, shaking his head at the memory. I was so stubborn back then, wouldn't accept help even when my hands were torn to shreds. You're still stubborn, Lydia pointed out affectionately. Just last week you insisted on breaking that new stallion yourself, despite Jim offering to do it. That's different, Daniel protested. That stallion cost us a small fortune. I wasn't about to risk him with anyone else. Lydia raised an eyebrow, her expression mock stern. And you're irreplaceable. What about your promise not to take unnecessary risks now that you have a family depending on you? Daniel had the grace to look sheepish. You're right, as usual. I'll be more careful. See that you are, she replied, her tone softening. I have plans that require you to be in one piece for at least another 50 years. They walked along the fence line hand in hand, discussing those plans, the children's education, the new breeding program Daniel was developing, Lydia's ideas for improving their cattle stock. Their conversation flowed easily from practical matters to personal hopes, each topic given equal weight and consideration. It was the partnership they'd built, day by day, challenge by challenge, working side by side. As the sun began to set, painting the prairie in golden light, they mounted their horses for the ride back to their home. Daniel glanced at Lydia, struck once again by how fortunate he was not just in finding love again, but in finding it with someone who understood him so completely, who challenged and supported him in equal measure. What? She asked, catching his admiring gaze. Just thinking about how it all started, he replied. A cowboy worked till his hands bled until she said, rest a while, I'll finish the fence. Lydia smiled, the same smile that had first caught his attention years ago. And look at us now. I'd say that fence turned out to be the best investment either of us ever made. As they rode home together in the gathering dusk, Daniel reflected on the truth of her words. What had begun as a simple act of kindness had grown into a lifetime of shared purpose and deep love. The fence that had once marked a boundary between strangers now stood as a reminder of how unexpectedly life could change, how the right person at the right moment could transform everything. Back at the ranch house, lights glowed warmly in the windows, and the sounds of children's laughter mingled with Jim's deep voice as he likely regaled them with one of his endless supply of frontier tales. It was the sound of home, of family, of a life built through hard work and shared dreams. Daniel reached over to take Lydia's hand as they approached. I love you, he said simply. I know, she replied, squeezing his hand. I love you too. Together they rode toward the waiting lights of home, their shadows merging in the last golden rays of the setting sun. Two lives joined as one, stronger together than either could have been alone, much like the fence they'd built that fateful summer day.